Hi, we're talking to Gilbert King today. Gilbert, welcome to the show.
Oh,
Hi.
thanks for having me, Laura. Really nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you. And I just wanted to ask you because judging from your Instagram, you're something of a photog. I was quite impressed with your pictures. And I was wondering if you could rank in order of significance three of those pictures for me. The Biggie
Yeah.
statue, the Princeton class photo of Justice Elena Kagan, and your dog covered in snow.
Well, I have to go with my dog first, although if I don't say that, it would be
What's
blasphemy.
your dog's name?
Maisie, and she's
Maisie.
she's almost 6 years old, so she's very
Okay.
important to me.
Yeah.
Um, but I live in Dumbo in a section of Brooklyn, and I just noticed that statue that went up fairly recently. And I was
Mm.
just walking by, and I said, that looks like Biggie. I'm going to walk up there, and sure enough, it was a statue for Biggie right on this hill. And curiously enough, I used to be a photographer back before I was a writer. And I actually did a photo shoot on that same spot on that same hill back when the World Trade Centers were standing.
Oh,
And so it
wow.
was kind of the significant spot for me anyway.
Yeah.
And so I took that one picture. And then, the Elena Kagan one was when I was I was doing a talk at Princeton and just stumbled into this little room, like a cafeteria club down in the basement. And I saw all their famous alumni. And I said, you know what? There's Elena Kagan. She used to clerk for Thurgood Marshall. I'm taking a picture of a young college student, Elena Kagan.
That's
So
awesome.
I would still have to go Maisie, Biggie, and Elena in that order.
Yes. Yes. I love it. Thank you. Thank you for that. And if you're listening, definitely take a stroll through or a scroll through Gilbert's Instagram. Some really cool photographs on there.
Oh,
Uh,
thanks.
Thank you for that. I'm Laura Cathcart Robbins, and this is the only one in the room, but I'm never the only one in this room because, as usual, my boyfriend, producer, and co host, Scott Slaughter, who I call Hun, is here as well.
Hi, honey.
Hey, Hun.
I'm
Hey,
strolling
hon.
through Gilbert's
Are you
Instagram as we
scrolling through his
speak.
Instagram?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Well, I'll tell you about him while you're scrolling.
Oh, good.
Gilbert King is the writer, producer, and host of Bone Valley, which is a 9-part narrative podcast about the murder and injustice in 1980 Central Florida. He is an author of 3 books, most recently Beneath a Ruthless Sun. His previous book, Devil in the Grove, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction in 2013. That's a really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, Gilbert,
Mm.
in 1987, 21-year-old guitarist Leo Schofield, I spelled his name wrong in the chat, but Leo Schofield was pursuing his rockstar dreams when his 18-year-old wife, Michelle, was found dead in a phosphate mining pit in Lakeland, Florida. 2 years later, Schofield, or Leo, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder that he has always denied. You and I talked a few weeks ago, Gilbert, you and I talked, and I listened to Bone Valley, which is your podcast that we talked about at the beginning, the 9-part narrative podcast. And I was absolutely riveted. I listened to it just for research for you because I was going to be talking to you,
Mm.
but I quickly forgot about talking to you, and I just wanted to know how the case ended up. And I know you found that case through a judge. Was his name Scott Cupp?
Correct. Scott Cupp. Yeah, he's a
Okay.
circuit judge down in Naples, Florida, down there.
So Scott Cupp, Judge Cupp, seemed to intuitively know that you would be morally obligated to investigate the case once you'd read the files. What year was that?
That was in 2018. So,
In
it was
2018.
more than 4 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. So
The
tell
way you
us.
just put it to me like that, I
Yeah.
just realized that might have been what he was doing. I didn't really have a choice in it. That just terrified me, actually, hearing you say that.
Well, that's what it felt like. He felt like he just kind of pointed you out in the crowd and said, you need to read these transcripts because this man is innocent. And he must have just known intuitively that you would not be able to ignore it if once you saw what was contained. And I want you to tell us what you saw in those transcripts that made you decide to put all your other work aside and dedicate
Right.
yourself to proving Leo Schofield's innocence.
Yeah, sure. It was a really hard decision because I was actually, I was in the middle of working on a new book. And, my books take 4 or 5 years to just do the research alone on them.
Yeah.
And, so here he is, this guy who's showing me this card saying, there's an innocent man. He's not just wrongfully convicted. He's an innocent man and he's in prison. And this is a judge, putting his reputation online. Actually, not more than his reputation. He's putting his job on the line because he's not supposed to be speaking out about these kinds of cases that are still in the system. And so I remember getting the card and showing it to some public defenders that night at dinner. And I was passing it around just to see what they made of it. And they were like, wait, a judge wrote this on his card? They're not supposed to do that. And they kind of passed it around. And there was this one judge from Polk County who said, I know this case. You should call him. And that kind of tipped me off that there's something to this. And so when I did get back to New York, I called him back. And, you know, the case was fascinating. He walked me through it a little bit and I was really interested. But then I told him, I said, look, it may be some time before I can get to this because I have I'm writing a book and I can't really abandon it. And I could just feel how deflated he was. You know, you could just sort of feel the body, you know, just like he's basically sighed. And he kind of made me, he said, look, just do me a favor. Read the trial transcripts. That was his shot to hook me because he said, that's what hooked me. And that's what should hook you too. And I don't know if I said it to maybe get him off the phone and said, yeah, all right, I'll read the trial transcripts. But I did give him my word and he sent them to me. And, you know, it's true. I was riveted by them. I was reading them. I'm used to reading trial transcripts. And I could see the wheels coming off this case from the prosecutor pretty early on. And I'm reading all these witnesses contradicting each other. And, you know, the state star witnesses brought in to great fanfare. And then the very next witness, her sister-in-law next door says, yeah, we saw exactly that, but it was like a week or two earlier. It wasn't that night. Right. And she basically went on to say, you know, I remember because I was working that night and I wasn't, you know, home. Those are the kind of things I was seeing over and over. And I just remember going through this going, you know, they didn't prove their case. This guy, there was a lot of like prosecutorial trickery. I think they were overwhelming the defense and I could see it. And I could see what Judge Cupp was saying about it. And I said, you know what, there's more to this case. I really want to look into it. Because I could tell he was wrongfully convicted from the transcript, but I couldn't tell what happened to Michelle or any of that stuff. I mean, that was the other side of it, you know?
Right. Yeah. And you do a really good job of letting us know that in the podcast, just because we really feel, or I felt like I was going through it with you. Like I was discovering the things as you discovered them. And my interest was piqued when your interest was piqued. And I wanted to know more when you wanted to know more. You live in New York, like you said. Leo's in prison in Central Florida, right? Which is incidentally where you are now. So I want to hear more about that later. But so just for me to interview you, there's, you know, research online. There's the 9 podcasts that I listen to. And there's the pitch that I got, you know, that brought you to my attention in the first place. That's just like the bare minimum of research that I would do to talk to you. Doing this type of thing, the type of research you had to do to really acquaint yourself with the case, really to get to know from this investigative journalistic viewpoint what happened. What does that entail? And I mean, I don't know if I can ask you this and you can tell me that you don't want to talk about it, but I'm just curious, like, how do you fund an effort like that? Because you have to have an assistant. Like, to me, it doesn't, no. I don't think that I could do it.
You know,
how
this was really different because, you know, in this case, I just thought maybe I'm going to go down because I don't know what a podcast is at this point in my life. I think I've listened to a couple of podcasts a few years ago, but I wasn't a podcast enthusiast. I just maybe listened to a couple. I had gone down there hoping to know more, thinking I was just going to write maybe a long form, you know, feature article about Leo's case because I'm a writer. That's what I do. But I didn't see this as a book idea. I'm really mostly interested, for the most part, about, you know, civil rights history and that pre-civil rights period and what the law looked like then, criminal justice. And so usually what I'm used to doing is taking a crime narrative and just following it all the way and deeply submerging into this area. And it's usually Central Florida because I've started to get to know so many people here, and this is how things come to me. And so the idea of going off on a podcast wasn't even real. I went down to meet Leo to just hear his side of the story and see if he would be convincing enough to me to be able to pursue his story. Because the last thing I wanted was like to go down and dedicate 4 or 5 years of my life for a project and then find out, oh, he's lying to me the whole time. And, this kind of thing has happened to writers before. Norman Mailer,
Right.
this happened to him, William F. Buckley. They've been sort of taken
Mm-hmm.
down these lines. But, those authors never did their own investigations. I was going to do my own investigation. So I felt like I wasn't just relying on other people's words. I was going to dig it out of the ground myself. So here's how I did it, basically. I knew I had a fellowship coming up in September. And so in May, I decided to go down to Florida. I say, I have 4 months. I'm just going to rent a house down there. I'm going to work down there with my research assistant, Kelsey, who stayed for the whole project. We had no idea how long this was going to last. And we just started going out every day and we would read transcripts, read police reports, and then just make lists of things to do. And that whole summer, we were extraordinarily productive. We got a lot of the story done in those 4 months. But then I got back to my fellowship and COVID struck, and they basically just sent everybody home. And so now I'm working at home, basically. And, what am I going to do? Well, I'm really interested in Leo's case. And so even though COVID kind of restricted our travel back down to Florida, we were able to do a lot of the research and talk to people on the phone. And so a lot of the research was basically done away from Florida for a significant amount of time. So it made it a little easier, but I can tell you from the financial end of it, I was doing a lot of public speaking, where I was still getting invited to talks down in Florida. That seems to be my hot space. So every time I got a talk or two, I try to coordinate them and put them in the same week. And then Kelsey and I would fly down and just work around those talks. And we'd get like 5 or 6 good days done and then go back. I lived in New York. She lived in North Carolina. And we just go back and just started work on the case and go through our tape. And we just did it like that, just trying to plan travel around my talk so that it was a little more cost effective.
That makes so much sense. And thank you for explaining that, because it's such magnificent work, and it's so I don't know what the word I want to use is, but you're doing something at risk to yourself for someone else, and who you're finding out about as you go along, right? So he says he's innocent. This judge wants you to read the transcripts because he believes that he was wrongfully convicted and innocent of the crime. And just also, because I want to talk about walking to the prison that first time to see him. But Michelle Schofield was found in a phosphate. What was it? Like a phosphate?
It's like a drainage canal for an old abandoned phosphate pit, like in Lakeland, Florida.
Okay, yeah, under a piece of plywood.
Right.
And it was like maybe 3 days after her murder. Is that right?
Yeah, it was exactly 3 days. They found her car on day 2, and then they started tracing back from where they found the car back to the restaurant where they knew she was last seen.
Right.
And about halfway back to the restaurant, they find her body in this phosphate pit, like along the road that she would have traveled.
Right.
It was horrible.
And so she had been brought there. She wasn't killed in that phosphate, the drainage area. Her body was taken down into it and then covered up with the plywood.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the state's case was that, Leo did this.
Right.
Leo killed her back in the trailer and then put her in the back seat of the car, drove her to the canal, dumped her out there, and then took off in the car. And that was the state's, version of what happened.
Right.
But, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. There's no blood found in the car. There's no blood found in the trailer.
Right.
I mean, this is a woman who supposedly stabbed 26 times in that trailer. And because they have a witness who lived across the street who claimed to have seen Leo carrying something heavy out that night, well, that put the crime scene in the trailer.
Yes.
That's how the state got pinned into their timeline. So they knew she had to have been killed in the trailer if he's carrying her body out to the car. And they got kind of locked into this timeline based around that one witness's testimony of seeing Leo carry something.
And as you mentioned, her sister later contradicted that testimony and Leo himself said he was carrying an amplifier out to his car at some point, like the week prior or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
And that was interesting because we were talking to Leo about it. Leo remembers the moment in the trial. He's like, why is she saying that? I wasn't even at the house that night. I was at band practice.
Yeah.
Why is she saying that? And then he hears the story in court that, oh, he was carrying something heavy out to the thing. And he's like, oh, I remember I did carry an amp out, but that was like 2 weeks before.
Yes.
And then sure enough, Alice Scott's sister-in-law says the exact same thing. Yeah, we both saw that together. We were talking about it right there at the houses, but it was a week or two before.
Mm-hmm.
So like already the state's main witness is already, and then she admits, she goes, well, I'm not good with dates.
Right.
And she says that, and the sister-in-law says, well, I am good with dates. I know exactly when it happened. I mean, so right then I'm like, that's their star witness, and it collapsed, within 10 minutes of each other.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and they hung on to that. The state hung on to the not the contradiction, not that the sister's testimony, but is it Mary Alice? No.
Alice Scott. They hung on to that one.
Yeah.
He just pretended that the sister didn't say what she said.
Right.
He just moved on, and didn't help that Leo had kind of a scatterbrained attorney, so he wasn't going to catch it either.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and that part is really riveting. I wish we had time to talk about everything that led up to that, because it's really, you'll listen, everyone who's listening, you'll listen to Bone Valley and you'll hear what I'm talking about. Leo was a transplant. He was born in Massachusetts. He has a Boston accent. He came from the projects there, right? Like in Dorchester or Roxbury, like somewhere in there.
Yeah, Fall River. Like remember that neighborhood in Fall River, which is known to be a little dicey at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he was moved against his will as a teenager, right, down to Lakeland, Florida.
Yeah, he went down, his father was doing odd jobs. His mom was like a cashier at Kmart. They were just going to start a new life on the paradise of Central Florida. Yeah. And, but he was like a fish out of water. He's like, I don't get these cowboy hats and, these alligators from the Florida Gators. And he's like, I don't know what any of that is. And like, I'm wearing these rock and roll t-shirts with this thick New England accent.
Yeah.
And, he was definitely a fish out of water.
And he has this kind of long, the style of rock and roll, that like the shoulder length hair, but it's shorter on top.
Yeah, a little Spinal Tap.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so I just wanted to kind of paint a picture of him when this happened. And so tell us what it was like walking to that prison the first time to see him, and what that was like.
Well, strangely enough, like I've done so much work in the criminal justice system. The only prison I'd ever been to was Angola up in Louisiana. And I didn't go in and visit any inmates. I was going there from a historian's point of view to look at the buildings and that kind of thing, because none of the people in my stories are ever alive. So I'm not really used to going into prison and talking to people. So, that was a little nerve wracking, although, I have to say, like, Judge Cupp, by this time I'd done enough research, and I was assured you're not going to have any problem with this guy. Don't worry, that he runs the prison practically. They were telling me, like, he's been there so long, he's like this force for good in the prisons, and they, you're only supposed to go in and see him for an hour, but they gave us like 3 hours because they're just so fond of him. And we're going in, and people are like saying to us, like, when are you getting this guy out? He doesn't belong here. Like, you could feel it in the prison that he just didn't, he wasn't like the normal inmate. I think to even the administrators, they're like, oh, this guy doesn't belong here. They kind of knew about him. So we were getting that a lot, and so it kind of felt like, oh, this is going to be safe then. The moment we met him, he's just extraordinarily personable and polite and, self-deprecating. And, I don't know how to describe somebody like this, but let's just assume, if you assume he's innocent, he's spent 35 years in prison for a murder that he did not commit. Not only that, a murder of his wife, who he loved. And so for anyone to survive that, I think you have to be at a special spiritual place that you and I can never really understand, not having reached the darkness of the depths of despair that he must have reached. And so for anyone to be surviving and smiling, like you're in the presence of someone special who've been through something. And that was the immediate impression we had. A lot of the things he was telling us, I went home and listened to the tape later and like, how did I miss that? That didn't sink in until now when I'm listening right now. There was some really profound things that he was saying that didn't really register at the time because, you're thinking of next questions. You're trying to steer it. You're not really as focused as you want to be.
Right. And then listening to Bone Valley, I, as the listener, kind of fell in love with him. And I felt like you did too. Like you were just really kind of entranced with this this man after you got to know him in person, right? Not just from studying the case files and everything.
No, in person. And, yeah, I'll just give you an idea because he definitely gets to you. Like I talked to him on the phone a lot and he just gets to you every single time. And, there was one time where he was just saying thank you to me for bringing up the story. And he's thrilled to hear that people are listening to it. He can feel the impact. People in prison, outside contractors, families of inmates are coming up to him saying they've listened and, they want to hug him. They said, I had no idea what you went through and all. And, that's meant a lot to him. It's been sort of validating to him. And I remember him saying to me, like, this was fairly recently, he's like, Gilbert, there's nothing I can give you. I mean, I don't have any gift to give you to thank you for this. The only thing I can give you is the knowledge that by you putting yourself out there on my behalf, it's never going to come back on you. You're never going to have to worry about the truth not being there. That's the only thing I can give you. And the way he said that to me, you'd have to be a true psychopath to actually be lying about that,
Right.
And so that just hits you so hard when you know it's the truth. And that's the way he speaks. You listen to him and you go, this guy's talking about memory. He's dealing with truth.
Yeah. And what's really cool is you get to hear that genuineness because you have tape. You go in to talk to him in prison, and then we get to hear those conversations. And like, I really heard it. I was absolutely, I mean, I was nodding along at points during it. Like, yes.
Wow.
And I don't know if we mentioned this before, but in the car where supposedly, if the state's case was, according to the state's case, Michelle was murdered in the trailer, then put into this car and then driven to this phosphate drainage ditch. In the car itself, there were no prints from either Leo or Michelle or anybody except for one person. And this print was on the windshield. And you told me when you and I talked that you had actually met with the man who had confessed, the man whose fingerprint this is, the man who would confess to murdering Michelle. Can you tell us about Jeremy and that connection and what Jeremy says happened?
Yeah, this is the strange part of the story because it kind of reminded me of I grew up reading about Son of Sam, and that was like, I remember the summer when that was in the news, and it was so intense as a media experience because it was before social media. And I remember just like, being nervous, like, oh, is he going to come up here? Is he going to, where's he going to strike next? Like there was this terror in the air for that time. And he started writing to the journalist, Jimmy Breslin. And so like, I remember just waking up in the morning, hearing that Son of Sam had just struck and running down to the store to pick up the newspaper. And I see that he had been corresponding with Jimmy Breslin. And that just added this intensity, like, wow, we know a little bit more about who the killer is. Mm-hmm. And so I'd been writing to Jeremy Scott for a long time and he would never answer. And I was told he just doesn't answer outside people at all. But it was right around at the time of COVID. And I don't know, he must've been bored. He started writing back to me and he would say things like, well, nobody believes my story, but I have a lot more to say. And I noticed that like, when he get questioned in court or, he was always interrogated and they're always getting yes, no answers.
Yes.
And I just said, I want to sit down and speak with him, and finally put through an interview request, and he agreed, he consented. And he said, I want to tell my story, but I don't know how. And so Kelsey and I went in to see him. It was a little over a year ago. And we went into the prison. It's exactly like Hardy, where Leo is, the same blueprint, the same everything. But, we're going in to see a totally different person. This is a man who's killed 4 people.
Right. So he's serving that time already.
He's serving time. Yeah. He killed, after he didn't get caught with Michelle, so he went out and killed somebody else. And he got in prison for life for that. So he's been in prison around this as long as Leo has. And so, it was just weird. We'd been doing so much research, talking to family members, talking to friends, people who grew up with him. And so we were learning more and more about him. But, he's a violent person. He's attacked nurses and guards and, all sorts of spontaneous outbursts. And every time we talked to like police that went in with him or private investigators, he was handcuffed to the table or there was a guard there. And now I'm going in there with Kelsey, usually, a young woman in her 20s, and they just send him in with us and basically shut the door. There's no guard. He's not handcuffed. And this is a man who's killed 4 people.
That's kind of
So,
crazy.
it was. I was kind of surprised by it. But on the other hand, I think because we were just storytellers, he didn't have any desire to attack. We were there for his reasons. And so I think he was just really relaxed around us and we didn't have one single problem. But, he was incredibly honest, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of his stories, he was telling us about, this is a little beside the point, but we suspected that he was responsible for another murder that had never been solved. And so we're investigating this at the same time we're investigating Leo's case. And he starts bringing it up in the conversation, like unprompted. Like I didn't have to ask him anything. He just says, like, it's like that cab driver, and he starts telling about this cab driver. It's a remarkable moment, really. And you could tell by the way he was telling the story, because by this point, we had done so much research. We knew the exact streets that he'd driven, the path of the car, where all the evidence was. He was walking us through that. And he was sliding in his seat to sort of mimic the way the car lost control. And he was pointing out on the streets with his fingers where it crashed. And I hit this car here, and then I careened across the road and hit a power pole. And he was dealing with memory. There was no way that he could have memorized that and try to trick us, because he wouldn't have been able to know that stuff. And we'd seen him, tell stories when he was trying to lie, and he's not very good at it. He messes himself up constantly, changes the names of people in the story. He's just not very good at it. But in this case, he was dealing with memory, and you could feel how emotional he was getting and how painful and how tortured he was by this entire experience. And that was just, that's the only time I've ever been in an interview where I was absolutely just blown away by what I was hearing. He confessed to 2 different murders and just told us everything about his background. And I felt he was being really truthful.
Yes, that completely comes through. I believed him. I believed him as soon as you started talking about it. And then once I heard, especially you and Kelsey kind of downloading what happened afterward, and which is also so good. It's just such good storytelling, the whole podcast. Can you just talk a little bit about the kind of person Jeremy is?
Yeah. That was part of the thing that was really, the more we learned about him, the more depressing it really was. We found out that he was like just not wanted from the moment of birth. His mother like passed him off to his grandparents and didn't even want to take ownership of this being his son. So he grew up calling his grandma and grandpa mom and dad. And we got, according to family testimony, his grandfather had a drinking problem and he kind of neglected Jeremy, and Jeremy would run off into the streets at 2 or 3 years old. He got hit by a car, suffered some brain damage. He's like homeless and living on the streets at 11. Can't really get through the foster care system. And he's, getting arrested for stealing cars and assaults and at a very young age. And, eventually he gets arrested for a murder in 1985. And the judge is like, it's just, there's nothing the system could have done. This is just someone who totally slipped through the cracks. There's no system designed to deal with kids like this. And, you could just see this life of crime developing at a very early age. Just, he's got nowhere else to go. And, unfortunately for everybody in this story, he's acquitted of that murder in 1985 of killing an older woman to rob her of her coins. And, by not getting convicted, he's back out on the streets. And that's where, as he gets a little older, now he's starting to sexually assault women really randomly. He's killing more people, not getting caught. Just really spontaneous robberies that go wrong. And so this is who he is. He's an extraordinarily violent, impulsive person, has a serious drinking problem. It's probably some drug issues as well. And he's homeless and living in the streets. He's just destined for trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And you also mentioned the brain damage from being hit, but you mentioned that he had a low IQ in the podcast, which is you're not mentioning it to be unkind. It plays into where he is in his life, and and how this might have played into the crimes that were committed, but especially Michelle. Leo Schofield and Jeremy Scott had an encounter once they were both had been in prison for a while, right?
Yeah.
Leo was appealing his case, and Jeremy was. Will you tell the story of what the
Oh,
encounter was? Yeah.
this is a story that Leo told us on the very first day that we met him. And, I remember it just so specifically because he goes, I should probably filter this, but I'm not going to filter it. I'm going to just say it. You decide what you want to do with it. But at this point, it's 2010. He's found out that the fingerprints in his wife's car are now matched to somebody, and they're not a tow truck driver. They're not a policeman. They're actually someone who lived a mile away, who was an extraordinarily violent person who's now in prison for murder. So like his alarm bells are going off, and now his lawyers are showing him pictures of Jeremy Scott and explaining who he is and where he lived. And they show up in court, and there's like 33 guys who are doing court that day, taken in from the prison. And Leo is underneath the courthouse in this tunnel. And he's the only one who's not handcuffed to anybody. He's the sole person, number 33. And as he's waiting online to get into the courthouse, he hears a door open in the back on the other side of the tunnel. And then he sees Jeremy coming in by himself. And they're leading him up to the chain. And I think Leo has this impression like, they're about to put the murderer of my wife and handcuff me together with him, and we're going to go into court because they don't know that we're not supposed to be like this. And Leo has this awful thought. He's been in prison already for 20 years. And he's become a very religious person. And he says, if they put that man on my side, that's God's will. Mm-hmm. And he goes, I'm going to end it right now. I'm not getting justice any other way. And he's going to settle it this way. Right. And he says Jeremy's getting closer and closer, and he's getting ready. He's going to take his handcuffs, and he says, I'm going to wrap him around his neck and take him down, and they're going to have to beat 20 years of injustice out of me. And it's this horribly violent story that he's telling. But at the last second, the guard screams, wait, back him up, and they separate them. And then he goes underneath the prison into the jail cells. And he sees Jeremy because all the other prisoners are in this holding area, but because of Jeremy's violence, he's kept in a separate cell. And Leo has to walk by him to get to the elevator to go up to the courthouse. And he stops in front of the Jeremy cell, and he says, Jeremy won't look at him. And he just describes this moment. He says, if that was me in that situation and I'm being accused of something I didn't do, I would have stood up and said, you got the wrong guy. Right. This is the wrong thing. And he goes, that's how I knew that I was looking at the murder of my wife. He just stared straight ahead. He wouldn't acknowledge me. And he said, know that I know, Jeremy. Know that I know. It's just this kind of chilling moment in the story. And, I think what really makes it worse, Laura, is like afterwards, Leo's reaction to that, not just losing that hearing and that appeal, but now he feels like he's a murderer. And he says, I'm not a murderer. And this is the way the system made me in here. I was ready to kill the murderer of my wife. And he goes, that's not who I want to be. And it took him years to get over this. Mm-hmm. And he starts going into this, what they call the war room.
Yes, thank you for talking about that.
Yeah.
I'll ask you about that next. Yeah. Ahead.
So he goes into the war room and he starts realizing that the only way to escape this bitterness and this pain is to somehow find a way to forgive Jeremy.
Well,
that's the way.
Explain what the war room is.
Oh yeah, sure. So this war room is it's just like a little closet. And really, I think it was a former closet, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. And it's got two little kneelers that you'd see like in a Catholic church. And around in this, it's all cement inside, cement block. But they have these wooden boards that you can put little prayer cards up there. And so the inmates write the names of people they want to be prayed for, and they pray for each other's names. And so Leo's going into this, doing this, praying for Jeremy, praying to be able to forgive the man who killed his wife, but also praying for Jeremy that God forgives him, because it's starting to hit him because he's a very spiritual, religious person. Yeah. It's hitting him that, Jeremy has just unloved. He has nobody in his life. He's got nobody supporting him. He just has nobody. And Leo's just, because of who he is now, he's like, that's unacceptable. Yeah, he has to find a way to get love in his heart, and I'm going to pray for him. And I think that's one of the most empathic parts of this whole story, is that the only one in this story with any empathy for the man who killed his wife is Leo.
Yeah.
Leo's the only one who cares about Jeremy. And I thought that was just such a powerful thing for him to tell. He was so matter of fact about it. It just kind of blew us away just listening to it.
Well, and I think what I think I heard from you and Kelsey in the podcast was because of Leo's forgiveness and empathy, you both found some compassion for Jeremy.
Yeah.
And yeah, right?
I mean, you're really right. I think we really took our lead from Leo. And so
Mhm.
like, the way we would talk to Leo, like, Leo, what do you have any recommendation? We're going in to see this man. We're going to sit with him for maybe an hour or two, and we're going to talk to him. Do you have any advice? And it's just Leo being Leo. He says, he's just always interrogated by people who kind of bully him. And he said, I just want him to know that I don't have any, feelings like that. I don't want to feel like we're opponents in anything. I want him to be comfortable with the people around me, that he's comfortable to tell you the truth. And, honestly, that was the best strategy we got from anybody.
Yes.
Just taking that lead from him, because we went in there really feeling that. And I believe that without having to communicate that to Jeremy, Jeremy picked up on it too. And I believe he was really trying to help Leo, even though he doesn't know Leo at all. He's not just trying to help Leo, he's trying to help his own soul. And that was what really came through in our interview with Jeremy. Like, he was doing this for a reason. He was tortured by his past and he had no way to address it.
Right. And so kind of where we end up with where you are right now in the podcast in this 9th episode is that Jeremy's trying to tell the state, I did it. You've got the wrong guy. Leo is trying to tell the state, he did it. You've got the wrong guy.
Yeah.
The state's not willing to budge.
No.
The grudge that Leo is holding, actually, it doesn't even sound like Leo's holding a grudge anymore. He's gotten married in prison. He has a daughter. He just has this desire. There's one part, and I might mess this up, but basically he says that he's created programs to graduate from because he's so bored in there. Like, he keeps getting degrees and certificates, and he's like creating them because there's nothing for him to do in this prison. And he doesn't have, what's it called? Like when you get black marks against you in prison.
I think called like demerits or just disciplinary records or something like that. I think demerits, but he has nothing like that. Like, he's just like a model inmate.
Yeah.
And, I think he's part of the reason I think that prison has really good safety numbers, because I really just think he's got this program in there, God Behind Bars, and he's just so well respected, and he kind of settles a lot of troubles. And it's interesting, at some of his parole hearings, you have like guards coming in and testifying saying, this guy, I was in a really dangerous situation. And Leo, just by using his words, really sort of, deflated all the violence. And like, they were so thankful to Leo.
Yeah.
And so they're telling these stories over and over. And yeah, he's got, multiple college degrees. He's done everything you could possibly do in the prisons now. And he's served his minimum time, 25 years. That was 10 years ago. He should be out, just based on, his behavior, his prison record, everything. But the fact that he will not say he's sorry for killing Michelle, he won't show any remorse. And that's been the deal breaker for him.
Because he didn't do it. So he refuses to show remorse because that would be an admission of guilt.
Right. And some states have like these, if somebody has a claim of innocence, they can't hold that against them, that if they refuse to show remorse. But, Florida's not like that. You can pretty much say whatever you want. And when you have the retired state attorney showing up saying, he might be a good inmate, but he's never shown any remorse. He's never said he's sorry. And that whole system is really set up and designed to keep people in prison. It's not designed to release people.
Well, I'm glad you said that. And because this is the other thing we talked about, I compared this case to the Adnan Syed case, who was recently exonerated, released from prison for killing his high school girlfriend after 23 years. And there are so many similarities. Adnan was a kid who claimed he was innocent from the start. Leo was falsely accused at age 21, served 35 years in prison. Both Leo and Adnan, the state's case against them was entirely circumstantial, based on nothing that was evidence, right? And in both cases, there was someone who had been questioned and eliminated when there was compelling evidence to pursue the case against them. The state also, in both cases, seemed uninterested in pursuing any other leads. And in Leo's case, this disinterest felt intentional, or at least it sounded intentional to me. Is there anything you wanted to say about that?
I think it is intentional. I've talked to prosecutors about this, and even prosecutors who went into cases that they felt that they had, a pretty clear eye on what happened in the case, and later on find out through DNA that the people they were prosecuting were exonerated. And I've talked to them about that, and they've admitted to me. They said, you get this tunnel vision, and anything that doesn't really help your case, you just push to the side, and you're only focused on the evidence that helps you get your conviction. That's not really what a prosecutor's job should be. The prosecutor is to pursue justice, not to win convictions. And so that's where I think the wheels often come off, where egos and, humanity enter the picture. And people, prosecutors don't want to lose, or they certainly don't want to see their cases get overturned, because, if you're trying to move up the prosecutorial ladder, maybe you want to be the state attorney yourself someday. Maybe you want to be appointed judge. You don't want something like, oh, yeah, he did send that guy to jail for 35 years who wasn't guilty. Right. That's a black mark. Yes. And so, there's definitely career considerations, ego considerations. And so I think this is just ingrained in the system, in every system, every prosecutor's office, and they have to fight against it. And, some of them are able to do it better than others. But I just happen to think that if you're in a really rural county or parish in the South, you don't get the kind of sunlight that you get in a larger city where there's maybe a bigger newspapers, more media that can look at some of these cases. If these are happening in real country communities that are, notoriously tough on crime, and they don't really care so much about, prisoners' rights or defendants' rights, it's just a different.
Two white guys we're talking about. Both Jeremy and Leo are white guys.
Yeah.
It's not even about race, which is the first thing I thought of when you and I talked about it. I assumed that these were black guys we were talking about.
Yeah.
These are white men who were basically just dumped into this system that doesn't work.
Yeah. And, I could go off on this for a long time, but, like going back to Reconstruction and, the birth of, mass incarceration, what a lot of people don't realize is you start making the laws, more challenging and designed to lock more and more people up in America. Well, you're going to catch a lot of poor white people in that system too,
yes.
And people don't realize that, well, this happens to everybody. I mean, obviously the system was designed to imprison black people. That's just what it was designed to do. But, this is America. We're diverse, and a lot of people are going to get caught up in this web. And this is the justice system we're stuck with.
Right. And then it becomes really that socioeconomic line. So I know you're hoping to bring national attention to Leo's case the way that Serial did for Adnan's case, right? To bring that attention, to keep the heat on. Because like you said, there have been a variety of people fighting, different lawyers, the Innocence Project, et cetera, but you've been kind of the steady one since 2018, looking into this and keep bringing it to national attention. In September of 2022, ABC's 2020 interviewed him, right? And wow, Leo looked like I pictured. It was really cool to see him. Kelsey looked like I pictured too. I had already seen you, so I knew what you looked like.
Okay.
Michelle was a surprise to me, but gosh, Gilbert, you did that. Your reporting got Leo a well-respected national television spot. And I want to know how that felt to you and what else you're hoping happens with your reporting on Leo.
Yeah, I think the main thing right now is that Leo is kind of out of legal options right now. His very last appeal was denied by the Florida Supreme Court. And so unless there's a discovery of new evidence again, which I don't really know what more new evidence there could be, it's possible, but it just seems really unlikely when you have the person who's forensically tied to the crime scene, who's also confessed multiple times, really what more do you really want? Confessed in detail too. And so, my thinking all along was like, well, I'm just going to put this story out there. And I think if people are as angry as I am when I'm reading it and writing it and reporting on it, that I think that I'm a big believer in the power of storytelling. And, I can tell you that as much as I beat up on Florida and their justice system from the past, Florida also does some pretty interesting things. They've actually been willing to address the injustices from the past, unlike a lot of, deep South states. So like the story I wrote about the Groveland Four, who were, represented by Thurgood Marshall, 72 years after those particular alleged crimes happened, my book came out, people started reading it, and there was a move politically to correct this. And so I do believe in the power of storytelling. And I believe that having gone through Leo's story and laid it out as cleanly as I did, shared all the things that we found, I think this is going to be just as obvious as the Groveland Four, that you have convicted the wrong person for this. And I think the more people that learn about that, pressure breaks pipes, and let's hope something can happen from that, because every day that Leo is in prison is just one day too many.
Yeah. Thank you for that. You have written about race, as you mentioned, civil rights, the death penalty, for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic. You're actually a really prolific writer and well respected. You're quite intimidating once I started investigating you. But why this quest to cast light on injustices? Why is this what you've chosen to do with your life?
I don't know how to answer it, except I'll tell you something that maybe will make sense. Like, I grew up as a kid, not a very good student, and I would disappear into my own reading. So I was never reading the things we were supposed to be reading in school. I would just go off and like, Count of Monte Cristo, this is the greatest book I've ever read. And next it's like Papillon, he's at Devil's Island, he doesn't belong there, he's wrongly convicted. And I just loved those adventures and the injustices. And I remember just being deeply affected by those kind of stories from a very young age, even like, I don't know, Roots came out in the 70s, and I was just like, that was my favorite show of all time. I couldn't believe that's the greatest injustice this nation's ever had. And it was right there being laid out to me, and it led to all this reading. And so I just feel like at an early age, I just got into these stories of, freedom being taken from you by the government on wrongful convictions and imprisonment. And it's just something that's just like, I can tell you, it's just deep in my soul. And these stories really mean something to me, like someone's loss of freedom at the hands of the government. And so I just feel like also lawyers, I think, are the great heroes of the civil rights movement. Before Martin Luther King came along, everything was happening in the courts. And so I just really loved the fact of these young lawyers up against all odds, and going out and fighting for these rights. And so I kind of write for these lawyers. I really do. I think they're some of the greatest readers I know.
Wow. Thank you. Not just for that answer, but for what you do. I really and the more I read about you, I was like, I think I told you when we talked, I'm like, oh, I needed to know this guy. This guy is like doing the good work. And I really appreciate it.
I appreciate your kind words.
No, of course. You hinted, or you teased, and you're in Florida on Instagram, that there might be more coming. Can we talk about that? Is there anything more coming? Why are you in Florida?
Yeah, I'm actually doing some work on some other things that I'll just tell you, like this part of the thing that frustrates me is the cab driver case. And I brought that into the sheriff's office, and I gave them all sorts of evidence, confession, everything, and they just kind of blew me off as if like I'm an idiot and I don't know what I'm doing. And they said, Jeremy can't be trusted, and we got the right guy, and Dan Odie. And I'm like, I know you got the wrong guy, and you're not even investigating this. It's appalling to me. And so I said, I'm going to do a little more work on this and try and figure a few more things out. And I'm going to write, I think, an op-ed for the Orlando Sentinel, and just to make sure that these guys are held accountable, because the answers they gave me as to why they weren't investigating Jeremy Scott are just absolutely wrong, and they shouldn't be tolerated. And so, there's some more things happening. And in Leo's case, there's something else that's happening too that we're doing a bonus episode on, and we're just sort of editing this. But I'll just give you an idea. It involves Judge Scott Cupp, so down here visiting him too.
Right. Excellent. Still doing the good work. So
yeah, it never stops. It never stops.
Tell me where people can find you.
Well, you can go to gilbertking.com, find my website there. It'll have, links to all my books. I'm definitely on social media, trying to get better at it now. I've never really much of a social media person before, but I have Instagram, Twitter. I'm even on Facebook. I'm trying to do as much as I possibly can. It feels like it's not so much about promoting me, but promoting Leo's case. And so it's a little easier to justify this presence of hawking things.
I appreciate that. I really do. It's the burden we bear when we're, wanting people to listen to these amazing stories.
Right.
We have to promote them and get them into the public's hands.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, Gilbert, thank you so much. This was so great. I feel like everybody that listens to Bone Valley would have wanted to have this conversation with you, and I'm the one who got to do it. So,
I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. It was such a conversation. That's what I really liked about it. It didn't feel like questions coming at me. It just feel like we were talking. So thank you.
No, we were. And I mean, I think the fact that I'm really a fan of the work that you do, and particularly this podcast, and the reasons for why you made this podcast and the importance of it. I think that really helps, because I really just, as somebody, I was the listener who was just like, I could be in your Patreon getting to have a Zoom hang with you and ask you questions. So thank you. And for all of you listening, please download all 9 episodes of Bone Valley, including the bonus episode, which actually might be out by now, depending on when our episode drops. But listen to all the episodes of Bone Valley and start paying attention to Leo Schofield's case, and see if we can make enough noise to get, the right people to turn up some kind of heat and make a difference in this man's life.
Thanks so much, Laura. I really enjoyed today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gilbert King, and I'm the only one fighting to prove Leo Schofield's innocence.